Welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Saltelli. I'm Italian. I'm a researcher at the UOC in the Open Evidence Research Group. I worked for many years in the European Commission Joint Research Center, and I'm by background a natural scientist. I was a chemist, then I did a lot of applied statistics and econometrics. I also worked more recently at the University of Bergen, where I worked more on epistemology, history and philosophy of science, and these kind of things. Today I'm here to talk about something a bit exotic, so something which we could call the sociology or the ethics of quantification. And we will start discussing this topic by making a long detour, a long story, starting way back in time to what we call the origin of the Cartesian dream. What is the Cartesian dream? Well, the Cartesian dream, which we will relate to the issue of quantification, is a dream of dominance and possession of nature. So man becomes not a creature of nature, but the owner, the master of nature in a sense. And the argument I will try to develop is how this development, this change in the way in which man relates to nature has an important element in the issue of quantification, in the issue of using numbers to cut reality in bits which could be numbered. So though the idea of the master and possessor of nature is from Descartes, the dream was more perhaps eloquently expressed by Francis Bacon, and in fact, the dream is also then later on expanded by a third character after Descartes and Bacon, Condorcet. Condorcet was lived a bit later than the other two. He died during the French Revolution in obscure circumstances, and he was also a great enthusiast about the virtues of enlightenment and the virtues of algorithms to compute, to apply to social problems. So what you see here on this slide is a long text which you can find in a novel, a science fiction novel already, published in 1627, so 1 year after the death of Bacon. And in this novel, the character meets a wise philosopher who tells him what science will eventually deliver for the good of humanity. Now, because you cannot read this long page, I will cut off the beginning and the end, so to see if we agree that this list of promise was eventually achieved. Now we read the beginning: the prolongation of life, the restitution of youth, we all live longer and look younger, the retardation of age is the same thing, curing of diseases, progresses in medicine, of course, mitigation of pain, of course, analgesics, maybe we even went a bit too far in that direction, more easy and less loathsome purgings. Obviously, in the age of Bacon, purging was not a very pleasant affair. They didn't have the pills as we do today. And then we go to the end of this page of promises, and this is natural divination. This is something we have to ponder a bit. What is natural divination? Well, divination, you all know what it is. You know, when someone reads the cards for you. Natural divination meant divination using natural philosophy, because scientists were natural philosophers at that time. So it meant predicting the future based on some kind of science, okay? So we could say that we achieved this because we can predict, for instance, the orientation of the axis of the Earth in a number of thousands of years into the future. We are less clever at predicting the economy of next week, no? But still we can say that in a certain sense, in certain disciplines, we have achieved tremendous progresses in natural divination. And then he has deception of senses, greater pleasure of senses. He finished with artificial mineral and cements, which you of course achieved, because if you look around you, everything which surrounds you is the result of some manufacture which has science and technology behind it. Curiously, if you read the page in its entirety, what I suggest you do eventually, because it's you can easily find on my slide or online, is that in the dream of Bacon, the modification of the human body was very important. The idea that bodies would improve thanks to science, even by modification of the body themselves. So something which we would today call transhumanism. So in a sense, Bacon was an early transhumanist. So the idea that you can modify bodies using artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and all those things about which people like Harari talk today. So the mission was accomplished. And now let's move to Descartes, the man who really, the owner of the dream, whose trajectory was quite curious. He was a good humanist. He studied with the Jesuits, I believe, and learned his Greek and Latin, his classic. But then he came to reject and refute all that, saying, oh, this is a waste of time, castles built on mud, a type of knowing which is only confusing and delaying. We should throw everything to the garbage bin. And what should we do instead? Well, we should embrace mathematics. And why so? Well, because if we embrace mathematics, and those are the words of Descartes, we arrive to a knowledge which is useful in life. So useful knowledge, mathematics, versus useless knowledge, humanities, ancient philosophers. And if we do that, we will discover the way to master the forces of water, air, the heavens. We will become the real lords and possessor of nature. So this is the famous sentence which everyone quotes from Condorcet, from Descartes. This idea of becoming the owner of nature is very typical of Enlightenment. And if you read the way in which the same theory is formulated in the word of Bacon, it's very much in the form of extracting the secrets from the womb of nature, dominating nature. So it's very framed in a way which today would be probably considered politically incorrect, because de facto what Bacon described is the rape of nature. No? And today we know that with our sensitivity of ecologists, we know that we have indeed raped nature. But the rape Bacon had in mind was of a different kind, of course. And then we come to Condorcet. Condorcet had really incarnated the spirit of the Enlightenment in that he thought that all the errors which had happened in the history of mankind were physical error. What he meant by that? He had in mind natural philosophy, because at the time scientists were called natural philosophy. So in a sense, he believed that if we do errors in our understanding of the world, they will also affect the way we rule our society. And so he suggested that, he made an example, for instance, to explain what he had in mind. What he had in mind was that overpopulation. Shall we overpopulate the planet? No, this will not happen, Condorcet said. This will not happen because technical progress and ethical progress will go hand in hand. So this is really a powerful dream. No, this is really, the words are the words of Condorcet, but this is really the Condorcet, the dream of enlightenment, that we become technically more expert in everything, and we also become better people. So that's the idea. We become better people. We become ethically more responsible. So we will not overpopulate the planet, because we will understand that the happiness is not about crowding the planet with human beings. That's an interesting error. So as you know, this kind of Hegelian idea of the progress of the spirit toward better and more responsible individual was very harshly criticized in modern times, typically by the School of Frankfurt, for whose authors Enlightenment opened the way to fascism, to domination of men, to capitalism, and eventually to a new barbarism. And if you, for those who discuss these things, this discussion is still very much active today, and probably a majority of people, well, I don't know if a majority, but many people still believe in the Enlightenment dream, in the Condorcetian version. Many people have lost this kind of illusion, so it's still a present debate. Condorcet was also very much convinced that he could improve social affairs, because he thought that mathematics could be used directly to solve social affairs, not only to master nature, but also to rule how men could relate to one another, no? How humanity could develop and rule itself. And this because he was an expert in what we would call today voting theory, decision theory, multi-criteria analysis. He was a wizard of he was a father of multi-criteria analysis. Still today we use in multi-criteria analysis concepts such as Condorcet winner, Condorcet ranking procedure, meaning by that if you have to do a voting process and you use Condorcet rule, you have a certain winner, which is different if you use other rules. So it's still something we use today. So as I discussed, the dream of Condorcet and the dream of Descartes, in a sense, all included a quantification agenda. Of course, for Descartes it was geometry, for Condorcet it was algorithm, but quantification was nevertheless there. And there are thinkers, modern thinkers like Alfred Crosby I mentioned here, this is a book I'm reading right now, who believe that what made the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution later so incredibly successful in the Western world was precisely this ingredient of quantification, the idea that you cut everything into parts, number them, and then work on them using various forms and various algorithms in all fields, from music to geography. And this is a very powerful idea. This would be why the Chinese had the same technology as Western developed in the 17th century, but it was the Western who conquered the world eventually. And his theory at this, what made the difference, his progresses in the field of quantification. In more recent time, this idea of quantification, I had a long story with many characters, I mentioned only one, Bentham, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, known for utilitarianism. Even today we use a lot of utilitarianism in a lot of, when we do a cost-benefit analysis, we are in a certain sense using the idea of Jeremy Bentham, the idea that you can compute the greatest good by adding up all the ingredients of a calculation which will lead you to the right solution. Bentham was also famous for the panopticon. You may have heard about that, the idea of a prison where the warden could check on all the inmates thanks to the geometry. So again, you see the geometry comes into play again. It's an interesting concept. If you like this kind of discussion, there is also a book called The End of the Cartesian Dream. Well, the dream has not finished, but the book is called The End of the Cartesian Dream. The book is available, you can find the book online. And if you like the book, there is an introduction to this book written by the philosopher, American-born British philosopher Jerome Ravets, on the rediscovery of ignorance. This is also another story. This would open another parenthesis, because ignorance was, as you remember from Socrates, the Socratic ignorance was a virtue which is lost with enlightenment. With enlightenment, ignorance is a vice. With this story of the Socratic versus enlightenment idea of ignorance, we close our first segment. Now we continue our discussion of the Cartesian dream with, of course, as I just mentioned, the dream, according to some, ended or is ending, but it is not ending in its capacity to deliver wonders. So I could now speak about the Higgs boson, about artificial intelligence, about gravitational waves. Gravitational wave is a fascinating topic. You look how now we watch the universe thanks to observatory of gravitational wave. Here I only present one slide, for the sake of time. And this is a few weeks ago, at the time of giving this talk, the landing of Perseverance on Mars. So man achieved sending people, on other planets. This is something I think not even Bacon thought we could do that. Okay, and if you are by training a natural scientist, you were probably nourished with this Cartesian dream. In a sense, you're training the way you were trained in follow the rule of science. And Toulmin calls Stephen Toulmin, this sociologist of science, called the Cartesian dream the hidden agenda of modernity. What makes us modern is that we share this kind of dream. And as I said, the dream was so successful that according to these other gigantic sociologists of science, Stephen Shapin, we have something like invisible science. So if you look around you, everything which surrounds you is the result of some technological achievement. No? Unless there is a plant in your office, which is natural, all the rest is not natural at all. So science and technology did it all. We live into science and technology, not to mention the computer and the cameras and all the rest which make this presentation possible today. So this is the invisible science of which we are surrounded. But let's now go back to the main subject of this talk, which is quantification. And so I will now give you the dark side of quantification. I will describe the quantification blues, if you wish, okay? Following what is now a rich production of work in the field of sociology of quantification. But first of all, I would very much like to stress that numbers can be visible or invisible. So when you look at the ranking of university, you are looking at visible numbers, okay? But when you go to the bank and you are not giving a mortgage because an algorithm has decided that you are not credit worth, those are invisible numbers, right? But still, they are numbers. So I would really try to treat all this universe of quantification as a single entity. In fact, this scholar I'm quoting now, Pop Berman, she also said that it is very difficult nowadays to distinguish ranking indicators, mathematical models, or algorithms. Now, this would be a technical discussion if you wish, but those who develop deep learning algorithms know very well that in their developing, they do a lot of things which belong to statistics, to modeling, to ranking, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to separate all these things. Even when you do mathematical modeling, your model is very much related to the underlying data, and some people talk of symbiotic relationship between mathematical model and their own set of data. So, as I mentioned, there's been an explosion of work on sociology of quantification. And I will show you a number of books which I have read. I will tell you if I haven't read them. And these books, well, here you have a list. Rigor Mortis is a book on quantification gone wrong in medical science. So errors were made in the development of pharma, for instance, because of erroneous use of statistical tools. The Green Book, Useless Arithmetic, is about poor use of mathematical models and its consequences in regulatory science. The Tyranny of Metrics is self-explaining, it's against all this ranking of countries, competitiveness, doing business, university, you mention it. The Yellow Book, which is a book I really wish you could read because it's small, it's very clear, very well written by Katie O'Neill, and she's not a philosopher, she's a data scientist, but she's very deep into understanding the implication of what these data do to people. Stat activism is also very interesting. This is not available in English yet, but we will say a few words about that. Trust in Number is a classic book on the relation between numbers and trusting in those who produce them. And finally, Alain Soupiot is a law person, a jurist. It looks at the problem of quantification in relation to quantification substituting for the law itself. And then there are other books. Quantification is about indicators of violence against women and human trafficking and how these indicators influence the issue which they treat. The Politics of Uncertainty is on how uncertainty is systematically neglected in most of these kind of quantification, deterministic quantification. We go back to the issue of ignorance here. This is a big book by Shoshana Zuboff, who is a kind of book describing us an impending dystopia, which is made possible by something she called the instrumental power, whereby the platform capitalism, GAFA, Google, Twitter, Facebook, and all these big companies, all these platforms are de facto conquering the world and creating a society which is then dominated by them. So thanks to this instrumental power. Engines of Anxiety is also another book written by Wendy Espeland. She is a very good sociologist of science, and this is about the damage done to higher education in the field of law by the existence of university ranking. This is an issue where I also worked for some time. Here I have taken some sentences from this book to give the flavor of what they say. So Wendy Espeland says numbers have reactivity. So you don't just throw a number into society. Once a number is thrown into society, it makes society, it makes change, it determines society. It's reactive, it's not inert, okay? For Engel-Mary, incumbent numbers affect what society will measure in the future. Think of GDP. We still use GDP, which was created in the 1930s for monitoring the business cycle, and we still use it today as a measure of progress because of a legacy. It's difficult to change. We have developed zillions of alternative indicators, but they don't have traction because we are so much used to GDP. And then for O'Neill, numbers create the environment which justify their assumption. This is a more subtle point. So the numbers, they also determine what is good and what is right. I can go back to the example of the mortgage I gave before. It becomes natural that the bank decide on your creditworthiness based on an algorithms, but this has ethical implication, you see? So the numbers, but this is justified. It's considered normal, that's the point. This is considered normal and is accepted, and hence society has, in a sense, changed. I mentioned Number and Trust is a very famous work of Theodore Porter. It's a very readable book. I will not say I will not describe all the book, but I will focus on a key element of this book, and it's a point in which Porter tells us of the difference between the operation of des ingénieurs des ponts et des chaussées in France, which was a group of French engineers, and the US Army Corps engineers in the USA. And the story goes like that. These people studied fundamentally using the same knowledge, they read the same books, which, by the way, at the time were French books. Once upon a time, in the US, they had to read in French and in German to study, for instance, urban planning on one hand and economics on the other hand. So they studied on the same book, but they had very different trajectory. And this is because in the French society, the relationship between the engineer and society was regulated by trust. Even today, France is the only country in Europe which doesn't complain about nuclear power. Why so? Because Frenchmen, by and large, trust their engineers. At the opposite extreme, the US Army engineer operates in a very complex institutional setting with mixed state and federal competencies. So everything they do is written into rules which have to be followed mechanically. And when you have rules, as Jerry Ravitz would say, rules can be gamed. There is always a way of gaming the rules. So the story of Porter is, if you enjoy the trust of people, you can quantify in an intelligent manner. If you don't have the trust of people, you can still quantify, but your quantification is of a different quality. So this is a book I suggested everyone could read because it's small and clear. Weapons of Mass Destruction of Katie O'Neill. And she says that what makes this algorithm, she described together algorithm, ranking. She also does not believe very much in this distinction. And she says, well, very often there is an element of opacity. You cannot look under the black box, often because these algorithms are a trade secrecy. Let's go back to the example of the bank. If you ask the owner of the bank to show you the software on which his decision is based, he won't be able to do that because he's not the owner of this software. The software is most likely commercial. And the same applies to algorithms used for recruiting, for the career, including our own career as researchers, prison sentencing, so software used by judges for paroling, custody of minors, but also for political campaign. You heard about the scandal of Cambridge Analytica, of course. So how this algorithm can also be used for a very devious and anti-democratic purpose. So And also, additionally, what makes this algorithm dangerous, they can be scaled up, no? They can colonize the world. Imagine for an example, the Shanghai ranking of university. It was developed for looking at how China was doing in relation to the other big continent university-wise, and it's now become a universal standard of university quality. So it's scaled up, no? So this system can scale up very easily. And then they cannot appeal. You cannot complain with the bank manager for the not given loan because, he cannot answer you. He is not, the owner of the decision, so you cannot appeal. For those of you who are on Netflix, there is this small movie, Coded Bias, which was written by this girl. The character is this girl you see in the slide, who was, in a sense, started her work reading the book of Katie O'Neill, and this is all about rejecting and fighting against facial recognition software. The story is that she discovered that being black, she couldn't sit in front of the computer and be recognized because the computer did not recognize black people. So she had to use a white mask. Wearing a white mask, the computer would recognize her as a person, and she, of course, didn't like this very much. And so she started this campaign. What you see here is the website of the Algorithmic Justice League. As you can see, their powerful newspapers have joined the campaign: Fortune, Forbes, Times, the New York Times, and so on and so forth. And now this is a quite vigorous movement in the USA to fight facial recognition, indiscriminate use of facial recognition software. Octavia Ocasio-Cortez got involved. There was a hearing in the American Parliament. It's an interesting story, but the movie is very nice. Lasts about 1 hour, so maybe you can watch for yourself. And this concludes our second segment for today. Welcome to our third segment. We will continue discussing a bit about quantification blues, problem in quantification. Now, something every scientist should know is the Goddard law, and the Goddard law says is a bit against this idea of the system, not the system which can be gamed. It says every time a measure becomes an objective, it is no longer a good measure. This is called by some people the Campbell law, the Goddard law. It has different names, but it's simply the idea that, let's make an example for researcher. Now, if you are counted by the number of papers you publish, you will tend to do more paper, making them shorter, no? The salami slicing idea. So, but in this way, the number of paper will not anymore be a good measure of your scientific productivity. You have simply adapted your behavior to the measure. Also, Müller, I mentioned before, discussed a lot logic of this kind, how this apply. The book of Müller, The Tyranny of Metrics, discuss issues of metrics fixation, because we are really fixated with metrics. Think of the media. The media consume metrics like, they really love those metrics. But the metrics can also be gamed, and this is also a big theme in the book, which describe a lot of case study from war, medical aid, education, foreign aid, and a lot of issues of this kind. And also especially discuss what the unintended consequences of metrics can be, like goal displacement, like Goddard, rule cascade. Of course, if there is this kind of gaming the system can be complexified to cope with the gaming, but then this gives rise to a kind of cascade of rules, no? And then there are, what else do we have there? Discourage cooperation, because if you and I are measured by the same yardstick, we cannot cooperate. We need to be in competition with one another. And so this would bring the discussion to the new public management theory and way of measuring the efficiency and productivity of work, and so on and so forth. So for this reason, Müller finished his book with saying, okay, so when you develop a quantification system, consider also the possibility that the best use of a matrix might be not to use them at all, at least as a possibility, entertain this possibility. And this would be by thinking of the possible consequences. I promised to say a few words about stat activism, and this is a current of sociology of numbers which come from the French school, which is very powerful. There are great scholars in this, like Bourdieu, Desrosiers, but even Latour, if you wish. Here is Pierre Bourdieu. He wrote a famous book, Les Héritiers, to show to the French people who were convinced that the educational system in France was very much promoting fraternité, égalité, and all that, was instead fostering and maintaining social differences. No? So it was really the opposite of what French thought they would achieve. So the school didn't help resolve social difference, but help maintain those social differences. He also said that sociology must be fun, so that the irony can be used in making those cases, for instance, in deconstructing a quantification. How can one be a stat activist? There are a number of ways of doing this. One is gaming the metrics, so using to your advantage the law of Goddard, no? So if you are a victim of a new public management measuring by objective strategies, what you can do is to game the objective. For instance, this is done typically by the policemen in New York. They are judging their performance using an algorithm called CompStat, and what they do is to change the way they report crimes. So they change to make their precinct or their department look better by changing the way they report crime. There are also another way of being a stat activist, and this is by throwing light to something which is not seen by anyone, by producing the right numbers which would make the issue become visible. No? And this, for instance, an example here in the book on this slide is about the creative class. For those who know, the creative class is something which is considered by some optimistic intellectual to be really the salt which makes the big city function. So one of the engines of the economy is really the presence of this creative class, be them actor, musician, scientist, engineer, whatever. And the result of the investigation done by the stat activists is that most often than not, this creative class is composed by people on a precarious job situation. You might have heard about the expression proletarianization of research labor force, whereby if you now enter in whatever university lab, the people doing the hard work on the computers or on the lab bench, they don't have a job. I mean, they are part-time jobs, and some people remain in this part-time job, till they are quite old in their career. Then another way of bringing to the surface hidden problems, another French case. When French Telecom was privatized, under the radar, people started dying, committing suicide in French Telecom. And nobody knew, till the French activists got into the act and with some help from the media, managed to show that there was really a peak of suicide in this company, and it is because they were being brutally either fired or displaced, to different France departments with dramatic consequences. There was a trial then in France about that, and the CEO of this company, unfortunately, got away with just a fine for behaving the way he behaved. This is also a very sad story. The stat activists also engaged with in the way in which inequality and poverty should be measured, and in this they engaged in a conflict with INSEE, which is a French statistical office, because for the French statistical office, the French society was not becoming more unequal. And especially for the people in the unions, they thought that instead they could measure an increase in poverty in France. So what was wrong there? So they start speaking with academicians, with statisticians, with the stat activists, and they came to the conclusion that they should measure poverty in a different way. And this is what they did. Initially they were ignored, but then Le Monde was interested in the story and ran some pieces on this. At this point, INSEE was forced to negotiate and to discuss with the state activists on how to actually change, even for the state, even for INSEE, the way inequality was measured. And it is important for the state activists, and here I have a quote from Bourdieu, that quantification should not be abandoned in favor of using exemplar histories or incommensurable. Because abandoning quantification would be an error. For the statistician, you fight a number with a better number. And one of their slogans is, a better number is possible. Okay, now come to Zuboff. And she has, I mentioned her already about the idea of the instrumentarian power. Now, this power whereby combining cognitive psychology with the possibility of running on platform experiment in real time involving millions of subjects, you can really come to acquire on people a power of domination, no? Pushing them, or pushing a certain fraction of them, which is also very useful, to do things in a certain way or to do certain things, okay? Like consuming certain good, voting in a certain way, and according to Zuboff, this is increasing even more existing inequalities and creating a new form of capitalism, which she called surveillance capitalism. The idea of Zuboff are to a large extent shared by these French sociologists and investigative journalists who really demonstrate how even industrial powers are using the tools of cognitive psychology together with information, with artificial intelligence and algorithms to dominate society. The French, I cannot go into much detail into that now, but the French author talks about the trollization of the public space. You know what is a troll? A troll is a person who acts as if he's an innocent user of Twitter or Facebook, but is in fact used to pursue a certain agenda and being paid for doing this, most often by private interest. Okay, so again, discussing the implication of algorithms, I'm sure you have heard a lot about about ethics of algorithm, developing ethical algorithms. And according to Louisa Moore, this is not really achievable. I mean, let's go back to the example of the bank. You think the bank would adopt a software which lend money to poor people? I doubt. Most likely they wouldn't, you know. And also the idea that, again, quoting from Amore, the idea that we can impose our ethics on the algorithm is in a sense delusional. For her, it's the other way around. The algorithms are imposing their ethics on us. She says algorithms are ethico-political arrangement of values, assumption, and proposition about the world. So I guess you understand what we are talking about here. Nick Coldry is also another scholar. This is very interesting. He talks about data colonialism. In this case, colonialism is not to be intended like something north-south, but about the idea that we had previously some space of our being or our existence which were private. Our leisure time, you know, our reading, playing, listening to music, talking to friends, and so on. And this space have been progressively colonized by, obviously, platform capitalism, and they become something which can be a commodity. So our space is being commodified, no? And so our life is being de facto colonized by those powers. This is also an interesting line of research or at least an interesting way of looking at this. This concludes this segment of the presentation of today. Thank you. Welcome to this fourth segment of today's presentation, where we look at the situation of quantification as seen from the law angle, from jurist, as I mentioned, Alain Soupiot. If you can understand French, there is also a wonderful series of lectures on the website of the Collège de France, read by Soupiot, small segment of 10 minutes, and here I give you the link on this slide. And so he discussed how the total market is leading to a normative use of quantification, whereby, as I mentioned before, now using this idea of the measuring the performance of the labor force, for instance, by objective, you are de facto transforming the old Taylorian system where the worker was selling his time to his employer in a system where he is engaged into the achievement of objectives, and so he is continuously mobilized to achieve those objectives. So it's a kind of cybernetic way, no? Like a thermostat. I cannot never rest, even in my sleep. I must dream about the objective I need to achieve. And again, all this is based on the idea that you can compute the efficiency using a system of measurements. And so it says, if we do that, what happens is that we are throwing away the idea of governing by just law to the idea of governing by algorithms in the pursuit of objectives which are to be obtained efficiently. And the conclusion, very pessimistic, which is reached by Supio, is that if this happens, as again I was saying, you cannot appeal. So you are becoming powerless, and because we are becoming powerless, society overall enter into a process of re-feudalization, whereby the only things you can do as a society, as a person, but maybe even as a country, is to seek protection from a person or a country more powerful than you are. For those of you who are economists, for sure you are aware that in economics there has been a very lively debate on the mathematization of economics. I have a few authors here who have discussed this. This is not a specific subject for today's lecture, but let me mention Paul Romer. Paul Romer, for instance, wrote a lot about mathiness. What is mathiness? We like a mathiness. Mathiness is when you, in developing economic models, you hide behind economic theory and mathematics what are instead normative positions. A position about, how society should be ruled. And this is again the great discussion on neoliberal order, no? The idea that the implication of the neoliberal model and then end up hidden under models such as the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. This is also a point made by Philip Mirowski. Eric Reiner talks about cyclical period of mathematization of the economy. Also Wolfgang Drexler wrote on what is happening when the economics becomes quantified. So this is an issue for those among you who are economists and want to read more on that. Here is a paper I wrote recently together with some of these people, including Eric Reinert, but also Jerome Ravets, which I mentioned before, linking the Cartesian dream to the Ricardian dream, where the Ricardian dream is a dream that, the famous theorem of Ricardo on trade, whereby the principle of comparative advantage, whereby if I sell banana and you sell Mercedes, we can happily trade and we will, of course, in due time become equally rich. Everyone knows that this is not perhaps the case, and this is perhaps one of the most flagrant, most dramatic contradiction in the way we understand economics and rule the world following economics in the present society. So the point is that, contrary to what I said so far, the prevailing vision in society, what we could talk the prevailing socio-technical imaginary, is quite different. First of all, you will ask, what is a socio-technical imaginary? Well, I'm using an expression from the sociologist Sheila Jasanoff. She's a sociologist of science, and she talks about socio-technical imaginaries is about how we conceive that our future will be influenced and possibly improved by technology. So how we have this expectation, of where technology is leading us, our socio-technical imaginaries. And of course, most socio-technical imaginaries present in today's society are optimistic. I have here a book by Aaron Bastani on artificial intelligence and nanotechnology eventually allowing automated luxury communism. I have the Harari, who talks about the wonders of transhumanism, whereby we shall produce a new brand of man, a new race. You know, we will go beyond Homo sapiens because we will modify our bodies. And according to McAfee and Bjornolfsson, who are two technologies, the world should embrace this platform technology because this is the way to go, and this is what will lead, progress and well-being for everyone. Which, of course, is a very difficult position to handle, to hold on to, but it is practiced in society. Also in quantification, we have a prevailing positive idea of the benefit of quantification. You might know Carl Sandstein. He wrote many books on the issue of quantification and cost-benefit analysis. He is famous for the theory of nudging, so the theory that you can gently push, using behavioral psychology and appropriate algorithm, people toward choices which are beneficial for their own good. And he has this strange idea that when people disagree, this is most costly because we don't know the fact. Because when they know the fact, they would eventually agree. This is also a very interesting viewpoint. What else? I can show you here Wilhelm Nordhaus. He won a Nobel Prize in 2018 for computing the benefit of climate change in a cost-benefit analysis extending to the year 2100. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this kind of analysis, but if you have any familiarity with this kind of modeling exercise, you will know that predicting something on a socioeconomic system 100 years from now, is very audacious, to say the least. What happened with statistical and mathematical modeling? Well, in statistics, the discussion on the problem of quantification is very active. I could say that statistics is the only discipline, even more than economics, where this discussion has been taken very, very seriously. What happened in statistics is that the statistician understood that their methods were being systematically misused or abused, leading to the consequences, for instance, mentioned by Harris in the book on the errors of quantification in medicine, rigor mortis, the book I mentioned before. So the idea that because you use wrong statistical model, you pass into production pharma which don't work, and so you, in effect, you waste money and kill people. So this misuse of statistics is resisted by statisticians, and some of them went so far as to collect signature to abolish, for instance, the test for significance. Some of you may know about the p-test, which is used to see if the result of an experiment are the result of chance or a true effect. This p-test has been systematically misused. Those statisticians for many decades have made the point that the test should be used in this way. And so for this reason, some statisticians thought that they could do a petition and abolish altogether this method because it was so easy to game, in a sense. And why people game the p-test? Well, people game the p-test because they want to produce a pharma. They want to write a paper. So there is a lot of wrong incentive in society and also in academia which push people to abuse those tests for the sake of their own individual progress. I have here more references on the statistical war. To Deborah Mayo, who is a statistician who wrote a book on the subject. I also wrote an article together with Philip Stark, who is the Dean of Statistics in Berkeley, on the subject, if you're interested. And we talk about cargo cult statistics, so to give the idea that there are a lot of statistics around which are really not good at all. And I think we can stop here for our fourth module of today's presentation. Thank you. So we now start with the fifth module of this talk, which is about mathematical modeling, which is the field really closer, in a sense, to my expertise. We follow the outline of a paper which was recently published in Nature on good rules for, suggested rules for a correct use of models by both modelers and society. These are the authors. You can, see quite a mix of different profiles among the authors, including philosophers, epistemologists, historians, political scientists, and modelers, of course, and statisticians. So it's a quite rich spectrum of discipline which were brought to bear on this kind of manifesto for good way of doing mathematical modeling. And the occasion for this work was COVID. Because as you may have noticed, with COVID, mathematical modeling has exploded in the public discourse. So you may remember that we were discussing flattening the curve a few months ago, the idea that we should try to control the speed of the expansion of the epidemics. And so everyone started talking, also some jargon linked to models, and with greater visibility came as well greater power, but also controversy. So power was evident. Those of you who follow this kind of information may have seen that both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump used to justify the measure of containment when they eventually took those measures on the result of a mathematical model run by the Professor Ferguson at the Imperial College. And so, as you see from this slide, this is really at least this politician made a big show of claiming to be following the science in taking their decision. Of course, those people on the opposite political front, or anyhow, who didn't like the adoption of this containment measure, attacked the mathematical model themselves, saying, I vomit when I hear about mathematical modeling. This is a very right-wing pundit. But also some academicians started talking about mathematical models as public troubles. So mathematical model, because there was a big discussion on the model of Ferguson. Why was it used? Was that the right model to use? Some people, including me, have reservation because that was not a model for suggesting policy, but rather a model for studying the evolution of a pandemics. But with this is you can read the original article if you are interested in this discussion. So finally, this is those are the 5 rules which we eventually suggested, to have it very condensed. Again, the idea is that those rules are not just for modelers, are for the system, modelers plus society, how this system should work in a kind of, I could say the word, not exactly co-production, in a sense co-production, but also co-use, we use the word somewhere in the article, reciprocal domestication, between these two actors. And the first rule is to mind the assumption, because mathematical models dramatically depend on what you put into them. Those are the assumptions which you use. So every mathematical modeling is in a sense conditional, is a kind of conditional knowing, okay? And there are in this assumption a lot of problems. Very often assumptions are put in and then forgotten. So people forgot what assumptions were put there. Sometimes the structure of the mathematical equation which compose the model calls for parameters about which we don't know much, so you have to make them up in a sense. Of course, if you wanted to get an appreciation of the impact of this assumption, you would have to run what is known as an uncertainty analysis, a kind of propagation of the uncertainty from the input to the output, and the sensitivity analysis, which would point the finger to those individual assumptions, uncertain assumptions, which are more important in generating uncertainty in the output. Though these kind of procedures are laborious and very often they are not done, or they are not done properly. If you yet engage in those activities, running a proper global quantitative uncertainty and sensitivity analysis, you may indeed have find interesting discoveries. I have here an example of a recent paper led by one of my collaborators, where we revisited the prediction of how much land we will need for irrigation in 2050, looking at existing estimate, but then engaging into this error propagation analysis, which is the black curve, the histogram, while the dashed lines are the prediction from different important mathematical models used to do this analysis. And you can see that more than half of our prediction go beyond the maximum prediction given by the modeler. The two bands on the extreme right, those are the biophysical limit, those which could not or could, be exceeded, again according to some estimate. But this is very serious because this means that we are being overly optimistic on how much land will be needed. Because we also run a sensitivity analysis, I can add that most of these assumptions are not reducible. For instance, they are linked to population dynamics, which are very difficult to predict. I mentioned that sometimes you need to put into the model, a variable or parameter of which you don't have an idea. And this man, John Kay, who is an economist and editorialist of the Financial Times, has a very interesting case about a model which is used in the UK for transport policy, WebTag. WebTag is a family of models rather than a single model. But if you look at how the model operates, one of the factors which you have to give to the model as an input is how many people will be sitting in a car 20, 30, 40 years from now. And clearly, who can know, how big the car will be and how maybe the cars are all empty because they are self-driving. I mean, it's really difficult to make a prediction on average occupancy of a single car decades from now, given that this is very much technology-driven. I could talk about that for hours, but if you are interested, this little book of Orin Pilke Jarvis contains many interesting examples of this kind of conundrums, modelers using assumptions about which, in fact, they don't have much of a handle. Then, of course, they produce a prediction, but people who are not, practitioners don't know how volatile this prediction may be. And I must say that the people who are into the craft, the people who do this work for a living, they know these things. Econometricians typically know these things. The late Peter Kennedy had the 10 commandments of applied econometrics, and one of the 10 commandments is to confess in the presence of sensitivity analysis. Why this expression confess? Because if you are a modeler and you do this kind of work, you are confessing to your users how uncertain you might eventually be. And other econometrician, I have here Liemer, also reflect on why this is not done. And they say, well, this is not done because sometimes it's distracting, because you show that you are very uncertain, so much uncertain that your prediction is not very useful. And for this reason, in order to show instead that progress is being achieved, you kind of, gliss on this kind of analysis. So it talks about a fanatical commitment to fanciful formal model. There's a big discussion about that also in economics. We mention this maybe later. Cost-benefit analysis, which is also some kind of modeling, is also famously rich in this, let's say, sensitivity to the assumptions. So depending on how you build it, you can prove often, not always, you can prove many different things. And if you want to know more, this is a classical book by Theodore Porter, Trust in Numbers. And the second point tackles what we call the modeling hubris, the model, how shall we call it, optimism. Modelers are often in love for their own creature. They want to make it more beautiful and they want to make it bigger. But making the model more complex may make the model less relevant in a sense. So the tendency is to say that the good intention is to say, I will make my model better and more complete so that I will describe reality better. What is the problem with this kind of approach? Well, this kind of graph, if you increase the complexity of your model, initially you improve its descriptive capacity, but in order to do so, you have to include more parameters, which their own error, and eventually this makes the error grow. So you have a kind of, this kind of smile curve, and eventually when you find yourself on the right-hand side of this curve, you are into the hubris region. You have built big model, but its predictions are really very much uncertain. If you're interested, if you're a number cruncher yourself, this is a paper which we just submitted where we try to put this kind of graph, which is a kind of a conjecture. to a mathematical testing by generating large families of mathematical functions to demonstrate that if you increase the number of parameters in a model and the way in which these parameters talk to one another, if the technical work is interact, you will have more and more of this uncertainty building up. So we try to prove some empirical testing of the conjecture that there is this kind of trade-off. And this stops the fifth module. Okay, we continue our discussion about mathematical model with this sixth module. Now we talk about the issue of framing. What does it mean, framing? Well, to develop a mathematical modeling, you must have to start with a problem. But which is the problem exactly? Many people may have different idea about what the problem is in terms of the characteristics of the system, its social component, and many things which enter into the construction of the model. Very often this construction implies also view about common goods to be achieved, what is the direction of progress, and so on and so forth. And then there is also the issue of who shall be the user of the model. This is also something modelers keep in mind. So there are these two variables, purpose and context, which weigh heavily in the way a model is developed, and this should also be expressed, made visible, very often the model reflects, as it is natural, the discipline, not only the world view, but also the disciplinary orientation of the developer. So some people, I don't know, the economists may be more attracted by a cost-benefit analysis, while the social scientist is more attracted by a multi-criteria analysis. I'm making this just to give you a flavor that they would also use different mathematical tools to go about their analysis, which is perfectly normal. What people should retain, and this is important, and this is a lesson which comes from the social sciences, looking at the activity of the modelers, of those who do impact assessment, policy analysis, and so forth, is that those techniques are never neutral. So a cost-benefit analysis is bound to give you different results from a multi-criteria analysis. And very often, the choice of the method determines the outcome of the analysis. So I have here two books, one from a political scientist, Gian Domenico Maione, another from a sociologist of science, Ulrich Beck, and they both say the technique is not neutral. I also mentioned here an article I wrote with some of my colleagues on the topic, so I will go back to it. So for Ulrich Beck, it is not uncommon for political programs, you see, to be decided in advance simply by the choice of the expert representative, which are among the advisors. You may understand this when you hear that Prime Minister has selected a group of advisors. You say, okay, you already understand, and this is what is a fact of life. You know what is going to happen from the people who are taken to advise the minister. So as a remedy against this kind of built-in bias, in this paper we suggest to say, let's use different glasses, different lenses for looking at a problem. So let's invoke different disciplines and maybe even different worldview. So we suggest including something called post-normal science, which is a way of looking at science in a situation where science is really being put to use for policy in a situation of uncertain fact, urgent decision, and also conflicts about values, bioeconomics in the sense of relational ecology, Maturana, Varela, Robert Rosen, for those who know about these things, and also no-Ricardian economics. If you frame an analysis using totally following the economist, but only one family of economists, for example, neoclassic, you will get certain result. If you say, no, we know that not all economists agree, there are more families in economics. If you allow more families in economics to contribute to an assessment, you will have a better plurality of voice to be heard. An important element in this discussion is that important international organization, but also national institutions and bureaucracies have a tendency to instead linearize or simplify the models for a variety of reasons, some of which even good. I mean, there is in many organizations a big imperative of standardization, communication. There are many reasons, some of them relatively innocent, some of them a bit more interested, for trying to, inverted commas, simplify the assessment within the easy paradigm of, for example, a cost-benefit analysis. And in this interesting book, which you can freely download from the web, edited by Schones and Stirling, two sociologists of science, they describe the reason why this is so, why contemporary politics wants to squeeze complexity into some simple recipe. And something should also be said about this issue of hypocognition, no? Or socially constructed ignorance. How is ignorance socially constructed? I refer here to the work of Steve Reiner, who has written on that, and how this feeds into the public discourse. And Reiner has illustrated 4 possible strategies which society developed to cope with some kind of knowledge which they find uncomfortable. So one is denial, there is no problem. The other is dismissal, the problem is small. The other is diversion, no, the problem is something else. But there is also a strategy which is model-based, and for this I illustrated here, which is called displacement. You build a mathematical model, and instead of looking at reality, you look at the model. The model becomes your kind of inspiration. So, for example, if the model tells you that progress has been achieved, you tend to follow that and not to see if progress has been achieved really in the system which you are studying. So the focus now is the model, not the system you are studying. An example is given in this paper of Reiner about the Chesapeake Bay program, where they try to monitor the load in nutrient, nitrogen and phosphorus in a given basin, but they, instead of measuring this, they kind of look at model prediction. And this is again a danger which is there. There are more examples of this in this other book edited by Sarevich, Spilke, and someone else. For example, the model Genesis, which is used in the US by the US Army Corps engineer for coastal erosion. Again, also in this case, the intention was to give the impression that you could model how different storms modify beaches or coastlines so that you can plan intervention of reconstruction. What's wrong with this is that these events of coastal erosion are almost totally determined by extreme event, so from the very big storm. Now, this distribution of storm is typically non-normal. It follows some kind of power law, and trying to model a process driven by statistical law, which are with so-called fat tails, where the unlikely event, are still likely, is very difficult indeed. So the criticism of this book is that this modeling activity really is not terribly useful, doesn't have much to say on the real system. Another point which society and modelers might jointly consider is what are the possible consequences of a given model activity, positive as well as negative, because quantification may backfire. Of course, the first things which will come to your mind is the case of the financial product. Many people discuss how the models developed by the so-called quants, which are the econometricians who look into financial econometrics. They were held responsible to a large measure for this reckless development of exotic financial products, which were responsible for the financial crash of 2008, Lehman Brothers, and so on and so forth. There is a rich literature on this topic. You can study the copula form, the optimism of this pricing model. So if you're interested, there is a lot of read about that. Again, there are many other examples. Again, I go back to the same book edited by Schones and Stirling for a chapter on a model using to decide whether a given country had or had not experienced a drought. Okay, So also in this case, there were countries who had experienced a drought, but the model disagreed. And so the international organization didn't want to release the aid which was supposed to be released when the droughts occurred. And even here you can see that mathematical modeling, proprietary also in this case, I believe, because very often these models are not free, cannot be inspected because they belong to someone, cause remarkable problems. Here I have an example which we discussed in the article on Nature, which I mentioned before, which is really, for practitioners of sensitivity analysis, incredible. So those people, what they did is a kind of extreme, a very rudimentary sensitivity analysis where they moved each parameter to its extreme and calculated the number for the maximum dose of possible casualty for Africa. This was done by the African branch of the World Health Organization. This prediction, I mean, I should now enter into the detail, but take my word for the fact that this prediction of 190,000 people could die is meaningless. This number doesn't mean really, de facto doesn't mean anything. It's simply 1 point estimate in a multidimensional space, I might say with zero mass. But again, if you go to the original paper, you will find more on that. And this concludes the 6th module of our discussion. Okay, we continue in the 7th module of this chat on mathematical modeling, exploring the rules suggested in the manifesto published on Nature, and the last one is the appreciation of uncertainty, including the unknown, the truly unknown. So acknowledging, in a sense, ignorance. And a point we make in our work is that this man, Anthony Fauci, is in a sense a hero because he had the gut to resist to a politician who was in a public hearing with American politicians, who was insisting to extract from him a number for the possible number of casualties in the USA. And he kept saying, sir, I cannot give you a number in this situation. We don't know what we are going to do. At the end, he exploded and said, there is no number answer to your question, which is the correct answer to do. But, it takes some courage because, the politician, he said, he wanted a number because, as we discussed in other part of this lecture, numbers are very useful for synthesizing, capturing, anchoring the discussion. But he said this discussion can be anchored to any number. As we already mentioned in this book, which was from Müller, it is for this reason that when you are very uncertain, maybe you should not use a quantification. This is not against quantification in general, but only to be aware that when there is this really danger that the quantification may backfire, it is better not to do it. And if you want to read more, this is another book which is freely available on the internet. You'll find a copy on my website. There is a preface to this book written by the philosopher Jerry Ravitz, who talks about the rediscovery of ignorance, because in a sense, with enlightenment, we have lost this appreciation for ignorance, which was a pillar of our philosophy before, Socratic ignorance, no? Docta ignorantia, no? The really philosopher understood that ignorance, or the awareness of one's own ignorance, was a kind of achievement of a philosophical reflection and not a problem to be solved with some rapid number crunching. So this need to rediscover ignorance, because if we know well what we don't know, we can have an idea of where we should focus our effort, among other things. So I mentioned this paper before, where we also try to offer help to tackle some of the issues mentioned in the manifesto. And I want to share with you some of those in relation to the use of evidence for policy, evidence-based policy. Though we already mentioned that very often this becomes policy-based evidence for non-political reasons. So we make a reference to the work of Nassim Taleb, which I'm sure many of you have read and love, when he says that we should perhaps proceed via negativa. What does he mean, via negativa? Instead of focusing on what will happen, try to focus on what cannot happen. So instead of predicting what will be, predict what has no chances of being. Why so? Because if you do this in a context of policy analysis, you can rule out a number of options. So you already led toward those options which are not totally forbidden. And the words I report here are those of Taleb himself. He says, we know better what we cannot do than what we can do. This is a normal fact of life, no? And also, when we remove possible ingredient from our spectrum of choices, normally we don't do as much damage as we add. Because when we add, especially when we add untried things, now we may run into the possibility of unwanted consequences. We could elaborate on this point using the example of geoengineering, for controlling climate. Should you go for new things in geoengineering or try to remove things using more tested and tried approaches? Okay, to give you an example. So we say, how do we rule out things? Well, we want to do this in a structured way. So we say, well, first of all, there is feasibility. Make an example. Do we have enough lithium to electrify the entire transport sector? This, if we know that we don't, we don't. So we don't even plan. No, an analysis of this kind was done for the UK. It was proven that there was not at the present stage enough metals for lithium, cobalt, and others for electrifying only for the UK the entire transport service. Viability is the second criterion, and this has to do with social norms, no? And social cultures. For instance, you will see that adoption of a tracking system works very well in South Korea and very bad in Italy, because the culture of those countries are different, and so different activities can or cannot fly in different countries and culture. Not to mention that different countries have different laws and constitution, which make certain things forbidden or not forbidden. Eliminating guns in the USA runs against a very important constitutional amendment, to make other example. The last point is also fairly obvious, is desirability. Do people want this given policy? You have recently heard about, there have been many referenda about that. One was lately in Switzerland, where people had to vote on a tax on fuel to reduce emissions. Similar things happened in Norway not last year. And the electors, by and large, said no. So they may wish to control climate change, but they don't wish to reduce their energy consumption. And if you give them a chance to express their opinion, you heard about the Gilets jaunes in France. This was really incredible. I'm not having a normative position here. I believe that from the point of view of those affected, this was a logical choice. I mean, taxing fuel is also a regressive tax which hurts the poor more than it hurts the rich. But you have to consider this when you design a policy, even when using evidence. So, in a sense where we conclude our manifesto saying that there should be a better domestication between models and society, and there are two important points. One is that modelers should behave more responsibly when they should refrain from overselling their certainty or the certainty in their results. And at the same time, politicians should not try to offload their responsibility on the model of their choice. And these sentences were, were received by, with mixed reaction by different kind of users. If you look at the discussion on which was developed then on Twitter and on other online fora. And this concludes our 7th module. Okay, we conclude with the 8th and last module of this discussion with going back to the general issue of quantification. And I want to share you with other paper or manifesto which I wrote with some friends in the Institute for Innovation and Public Policy at University College of London. This is the institute led by Mariana Mazzucato. And what we do in this kind of paper, which is very short, is just to say that we should pay much more attention on how quantification is ruled, how quantification is developed, and we should really look more carefully into sociology and ethics of quantification. We make reference to a large existing body of literature, which I mentioned at the beginning, saying that the world is really structured by the numbers. So the real is constructed with a number, and those numbers, as we discussed, are seductive. You know, everyone wants it, like the politician. They are performative, they change the real. They give epistemic authority, we discussed this as well. And so it isn't even the idea that it is impossible to govern a state or even to contest the government without numbers. And a last point, which is very important, number, because they confer epistemic legitimacy and power, they also may create or contribute or reinforce existing power asymmetry. Those are reasons why we should be very careful about how these numbers are produced and used in society. Also because another important element is numbers illuminate a given issue. So if I can provide a number which describes a reality, this piece of reality gets the attention, no? But why other parts of the same reality may remain hidden. So in a sense, this is one more reason why we should be careful to where we want to draw the attention of people. We mentioned before how the stat activists in France, use numbers to call attention of people to different issues. For the sociologists, this is fairly obvious. Dewey, the great American pragmatist, has written a lot about this issue of using also numbers for a process of social discovery. So there are phenomena out there in our society or in our environment or in our health which are unknown. Society doesn't know about them. We have to discover them, and so scholars can assist in this process of social discovery, among other ways, by producing numbers which capture this reality. Here, again, in this paper, we mentioned dangerous numbers. So where a number can do damage, and this is in medical research, there are books about that. In higher education, rating, rankings, very damaging. Even in the governance of science, because all the scientists are very much aware that their system based on impact factor, age factor, is very counterproducing. Finance we mentioned already, but also, again, for this process of bureaucratic linearization, simplification, which we discussed already, the numbers produced by international organizations are can be very problematic, because also they may tend to create kind of north-south, kind of neo-colonialism driven by number, and this holds for the World Bank, for the FAO, for the OECD, for many of these international organizations. Someone should keep an eye on what numbers they produce. You may have heard the recent furious discussion about the Doing Business Index. So for those of you who are interested, you will find something about that. And there is also in this kind of quantification game, the fashion. No, there are fashions. Some methods become trendy since a number of years. For instance, randomized controlled trials have been defined as a golden standard in measuring the effectiveness of policy. But this method also have their drawbacks, which should be well known and studied and communicated to the user, instead of simply telling them that this is a gold standard. The gold standard. Whose gold standard, one might ask? No, the World Bank or the population which are on the receiving hand of these kind of measures. And very often, the sophistication of the econometric technique you employ it to make a case for a given policy hides the normative interest of those who produce this policy, either the institution or the researcher themselves. For all this reason, we have made a parallel between the recent discussion which was had on gene editing. They said, gene editing has become so dangerous that we should have an observatory about gene editing to keep an eye on what's going on. And this is an initiative which has been taken, among others, by sociologist Sheila Jasanoff, whom we mentioned already in our talk. And we say, but numbers can do, also considerable damage, even perhaps more than biotechnologies themselves. And for this reason, maybe what we want to do is to create an observatory for these numbers. We haven't done this yet. This is just an idea we are discussing, but if you look at what already exists on the ground, there are many organizations and initiatives to do precisely that. For instance, the French CNRS, Conseil National de Recherche Scientifique, already has a project called Society for the Social Studies of Quantification. There is in the University of Cardiff a data justice lab, so to fight this kind of data colonialism or kind of algorithmic feudalism or this kind of phenomena. We also mentioned during this talk the Algorithmic Justice League in the USA and the European Parliament as a group studying artificial intelligence. So there are already many initiatives and more could be developed to increase the awareness of society in relation to this important protagonist of our public life, exactly numbers. Okay, I'm finished. If you want to find more, all my papers and resources and books you can find quite a rich set of information on my own website, which is very simple, it's just my name. If you go under resources, you will find all my presentation, including this one, but also books, articles, which are free for you to download. Thank you for your attention.